From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. I'm Peggy Pearlstein, head of the Hebraic section here in the African Middle Eastern Division of the Library of Congress. And I'm happy to welcome you to today's program where Susan Magee will talk about her book on artist Kalman Aron. And to introduce Susan, I would like to have Sharon Horowitz, our senior reference librarian, come up.
Thank you, Peggy. On behalf of the Hebraic section, welcome to the African and Middle Eastern Reading Room. Our speaker today, Susan Magee, is a graduate of Pomona College and the Wharton School of University of Pennsylvania, a teacher of meditation and a hypnotherapist with 25 years of experience in the healing arts, having shifted her career path from the fields of business and politics. In her book, Into the Light, The Healing Art of Kalman Aron, she has collaborated with the artist to write about his life in what one reviewer called a mix of memoir, biography, and commentary. The book includes a beautifully reproduced retrospective of Mr. Aron's work, extraordinary portraits and landscapes, as you will see. Susan's friendship with Mr. Aron began when she sat for a portrait at age 6. After seeing the 2002 movie, The Pianist, Mr. Aron asked her to tell his story. And Susan has spent many years conducting interviews with the artist and others, tracing his life's path from his birth in Riga, Latvia, through labor and concentration camps, to finally arriving in Hollywood, California. The details of both Mr. Aron's particular story and the book's universal story about the healing process I leave for Susan to show and tell. But before I relinquish the podium, let me mention that this event is being videotaped for subsequent broadcast on the library's webcast and other media. There will be a formal question and answer period after the lecture in which the audience is encouraged to ask questions and offer comments. But please be advised that your voice and image may be recorded and later broadcast. By participating in the question and answer period, you are consenting to the library's possible reproduction and transmission of your remarks. And now, please join me in welcoming Ms. Susan Magee.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Thank you, Peggy, and thank you, Sharon. As I said, my mother is smiling in heaven to see me in this beautiful reading room. I'm thrilled and honored and privileged to do this presentation here, and I love the building. Let me begin by talking a little bit. When Kalman asked me to write his story, the questions I had in my mind were, how did the Holocaust impact him? How did the Holocaust inform his life and his art over a lifetime? And how did he respond to the experience that he had in the Holocaust? Now, if you ask those questions to Kalman, he'll say, I don't know. He's a painter, and he expressed all of this on canvas unconsciously throughout the decades that he painted until he decided at age 78 to tell his story. Fortunately, I left the business and government world some years ago and began my own spiritual journey of healing and became a healer and became a hypnotherapist, so I was able to go into his paintings and ask those questions, because if I asked him, he'd just say, I don't know why I did it, I just did it. So I spent 5 months in the quiet of Cape May, New Jersey with 10 groups of his paintings, and I asked the questions, and the paintings started to talk to me. So I was lucky that I'd had my own healing journey, and I was lucky that I had enough training in meditation that I could pull out the meaning of his art in terms of how his experience in the Holocaust affected him. So the book is really 2 stories woven together. It's his story as he tells it in his own voice, and it's his story as I understand it from the meaning of what I pick up in his art and in his paintings. So Into the Light, from my perspective, is a story of a living master. Welcome, John. My husband just arrived. That would make my mother very happy. It celebrates the story of a living artist, and it presents his visual record of his journey out of the darkness of the Holocaust into the light. He was born an artist. He was a child prodigy. As Sharon said, he spent 4 years in the Holocaust, 2.5 in the Riga ghetto, and then across Europe in 7 camps. During the Holocaust, he did a couple of things. He took the risk of drawing sketches of guards to get an extra piece of bread. They would then bring photographs of their children to draw, and it helped him not starve. The second thing he did is that he, with intense concentration, watched the guards. He knew when he was born how to draw somebody's face. What he learned in the Holocaust were how people expressed their emotions in their body, because he studied them. And while he was studying them, he learned how to literally disappear and become invisible to them. And he started doing this in the Riga ghetto. He survived. He applied for visas. The first that came up was Los Angeles in America. He moved to America and then successfully painted for a lifetime, always doing well, but kind of keeping a veil over his art. He'd never go to New York when he had a chance for big shows there, DC, Florida. Always succeeded as a successful artist until age 78. And that's when he turned to me and asked me to tell his story. So for me, Kalman healed himself in 2 processes. He healed himself unconsciously by painting, because he worked everything out on canvas. And he healed himself at the time he decided to remember cognitively and get over this decision to be invisible for the rest of his life, that invisibility was life, and if he were seen, he was going to die. So he literally came out of a world of black and white. His paintings are a mirror of what's going on inside him, into a world of color, and that's how he healed himself. My journey begins with him in a wonderfully interesting way. My mother was an interior decorator in the 50s. She went to a gallery where she had things framed for herself and her clients, and in the window was this pastel portrait of a black-eyed Mexican boy, and it reached into her heart and grabbed her because she had lost a black-eyed baby 10 years before at 9 months. She went into the gallery owner, asked who painted that. He explained, an emigre, just come from Europe. She said, I want to meet him. She learned that he had done drawings in the camps from photographs, and she said, please have him call me. I want him in my home. I'd like him to paint my 2 living daughters, and I want him to paint the daughter that I lost. And this was the baby that my parents lost. She was named after my mother, Marichu. They called her Nani, but you can see the black eyes in both these portraits. And then I remember, this is the portrait he did of my sister, and this is the portrait he did of me. And I can remember to this day when this lithe young man with curls, blonde curls and blue eyes, walked into our living room. He told me to sit still, and he'd go like this on and then he'd look and take his thumb as though measuring the relationship of my nose to my eyes. I don't know what, but he clearly knew what he was doing. And when he was done, I saw myself. And I believe, when I look in my eyes, I have been curious about the meaning of life forever. I've been curious about this cruelty and suffering on this earth, and I think he caught that in me at age 6. Now, my mother introduced him to all of her clients and essentially kept him busy painting portraits throughout the 50s. They became lifelong friends. And then it was literally 50 years after the first time I met him, that I was in Palm Springs visiting my mother. I called Kalman and said, why don't you come and bring some of your new art? He'd just seen The Pianist. He said it gave him permission. He'd never wanted to talk about the details of what had happened. It gave him permission. People had asked him over the years to do a book or a film on his life. He didn't trust them, and completely out of the blue, he turned to me and said, Susan, will you write my story? I took it seriously because 16 years before that, in a meditation, I saw this huge book come out of my stomach. And I looked, and there was no title. I looked for a table of contents. There was none. And I said, what is this about? And what I heard was good and evil. This is a book you're going to write about good and evil. I said, tell me more. Not now. And it was such a powerful experience. I knew I was going to write a book. I didn't know until that day in Palm Springs that it was his story. So, Kalman was born in Riga, Latvia in 1924. He had his first gallery show at age 7, and all of the drawings were gone the first day. At age 13, the president of Latvia learned about him and asked him to do a formal portrait in the palace, which he did. The president, Karl Humanis, was so impressed, he pulled him out of his local Jewish neighborhood school and put him in the Riga Fine Arts Academy at age 14. Kalman loved it. And then at age 17, in 1941, the Germans arrived, immediately took his father and his uncle, David and Klein, and he never saw them again. They were among the first Latvian Jews killed. They were told to leave their home, his mother, his brother who was older, and himself, and they were put into a ghetto. I've gone to the neighborhood. It had room for about 8,000 people. Mostly Russians lived there at the time. They put 30 to 35,000 Latvian Jews in this small neighborhood. They fenced it all off, and within 5 months, they took 25,000 Riga Jews, women, men, and children, to Rumbala Forest and killed them in the most horrendous way, and that was how he lost his mom. They kept 4,000 young men who were strong enough to work alive. Kalman and his brother were among them. And this is when he began to risk his life. If you were caught with a pencil and paper at that time, you could just be shot because they would be afraid you were sending a message out to escape. But that's when he started drawing guards. There was one German in the factory where he worked who was a painter who saw what Kalman could do. He got him a canvas, he got him oils, and had him paint a portrait of him. He's never forgotten that man. And it's also when he began to learn to disappear. In 1943, the Germans closed the Riga ghetto, and he began a journey across Europe in camps in Latvia, Poland, and in Germany. He was in Kaiserwald, which was outside the outskirts of Riga, and that was a transit camp. That's when he and his brother were separated. He was then sent into Poppervallen and Dudaga. There's a lot less known about what happened in Latvia than in other countries during the Holocaust. I found people who had been alive at the time, who took me to these two places in the forest of Latvia. This Baltic forest, nothing is there. It's freezing cold, and he was in those two work camps. Then as the Russians started to come towards Latvia, they walked them to the ocean to move them down to Poland. That's the one time he was beaten. He tried to hide in a haystack, and a little boy saw him and turned him in. And that was the only time he was beaten throughout the 4 years. So he went in a boat from Labaha, is the name of the city on the coast of Latvia, down to Stutthof, where he was reunited with his brother for a very short time, a couple of weeks. And then he was put on a train, he didn't know to where, to Buchenwald. He was moved to the Reimsdorf subcamp where he worked in a synthetic gasoline factory. And then as the Allies were bombing Buchenwald and Reimsdorf, he and a little over 2,000 prisoners were put on a train. The Allies bombed the train. They walked for 4 miles. He was one of about 575 people who survived that move from Reimsdorf to Theresienstadt. And in Theresienstadt, within 4 or 5 days, the Russians arrived. If you ask Kalman how he survived, he'd say a couple of things. He was very lucky that he was young and strong and able to work. He drew for bread for himself and his brother. He learned literally how to become invisible. He never, ever gave up hope. And if you talk to survivors, I've heard this many times, Kalman said if somebody, whether they were starving or not, gave up hope, you'd see it in their eyes, and within a day or two they were gone. You simply couldn't give up hope. And he lived minute to minute, not day to day, but minute to minute. And the other thing that sustained Kalman, he always had a very strong relationship with nature. He's always he's always painted landscapes. And in Buchenwald, when he got there, there were the Jewish camp was called the Little Camp. If you've ever been there, it's down at the bottom of the hill. The barracks were full. By the time he got there, he slept on the ground next to a rock. And he said he'd look up at the stars at night and say, the Nazis cannot control the stars at night nor the sun in the morning. And when he'd wake up each morning, he'd say to himself, I've survived one more day. So nature has always sustained Kalman. Now, when he was liberated, he wasn't really liberated because the Russians had reoccupied Latvia and Estonia and Lithuania. So he and 5 other Latvians and Lithuanians were set aside, taken in a truck to a forest, held up by gunpoint by these Russians, and Kalman thought he was going to be killed. They stole the Red Cross packages, and then they went to go find some horses and just told the 6 men to stay there, and they all looked at each other and said, I don't think that's a good idea. So they escaped the Russians. They found their way to Prague. They were afraid to be seen because it was clear they were in Russian territory, and it was clear that they were Latvian and Lithuanian Jews. A truck came by. They finally asked for help, and the driver was a Russian Jew, and he knew they were Jewish. And he hid them in the back of his truck and got them to Prague in safety. So at the end of this war, Kalman was one of 1,000 Latvian Jews to survive. There were 70 to 75,000 at the beginning of the war, and they were killed almost within the first 6 months. The Wannsee Conference came long after the majority, long after at least 90% of the Latvian Jews were gone, killed. They were killed extremely quickly. Now, he was in Salzburg in a displaced persons camp, always drawing to get an extra piece of bread. A judge, a former judge, a Jewish judge, American GI, took 2 of his drawings, sent them to the Fine Arts Academy in Vienna, which is one of the finest art schools in Europe. He doesn't even know about this. He gets a letter. You have a full 4-year scholarship if you can make your way from Salzburg to Vienna. His friends said, you're crazy. You're going to be in the Russian territory. You have no food. You're going to go hungry. He was an artist. There was no way he was not going to do this. So he made his way, again, escaping Russians on the train on the way to Vienna, and he loved this art school. When he arrived, the head of the art school said, some years ago, a young man came to be a student here. We didn't think he was qualified. We turned him his way. His name was Adolf Hitler. He couldn't draw. He also met a lovely young woman, Gertrude Schneider, who lost most of her family in Vienna. She had gone at age 13 on the Kindergarten train to England, and so she lived through the war in England. They were kind of, as Trudy said, 2 lost souls together. When Kalman decided, when he got the opportunity to come to America on the visa, he married Trudy because she wanted to get out of Europe as well, and they came to America together. And she just died. I spent a lot of time with Trudy, wonderful, wonderful woman. So this is a painting that Kalman did in Uppsala, Sweden, when he had a show in the 70s. But Sweden and Riga are very similar in climate and the way they look. So this is the closest kind of winter scene that I could find that he had painted that was similar to Riga. He will not go back to Latvia. He will not go back to Riga. When I went back and did his whole journey, he said, I'm not going. They killed my mother. I am not going back. And he said, furthermore, I don't think it's safe for you to go either, Susan. But this gives you a feel for the kind of climate that he had lived as a child growing up, and this is the climate that he left. Now, he arrives in LA, which is a place of warmth and light and color, a very different place to live. And Los Angeles, since 1949, has provided sanctuary to him. And as a native Californian, I asked myself, how is it different than Riga? Well, California is a place, Southern California is a place of open vistas. There were no walls for Kalman there. There were no boundaries. He was not closed in. It's obviously been a place of new beginnings for generations of immigrants and Americans. It's a home for creative people. You can do whatever you wish in the arts, in film. I always think of Walt Disney, whom I grew up with and loved. Steven Spielberg. It's a wonderful place for creativity. And then, very importantly, it's so spread out, it was a place that he could remain invisible. He could be successful as an artist for a lifetime. Directors, producers, lots of famous folks had him paint them. But he could stay under the radar. When I was in Vienna, I realized, had he been in Vienna after the war, he could have never hidden his light. He would have been known, because it's a small community, they care about art and culture. But in LA, you could stay pretty invisible. He achieved success quickly. As I mentioned, in the 50s, Mom got him all kinds of commissions for portraits. He was named one of the most outstanding young American artists in 1956. He was commissioned to do people like Henry Miller. They became good friends, the writer Henry Miller. This is a wonderful oil with great, strong brushstrokes. He got a commission during Reagan's presidential campaign in 1980 to do this poster for the campaign. One way he stayed invisible is when it was done, they printed it, and the red was not the right color, and he would not let them use it for his presidential campaign. This is a painting of Andre Previn, the composer, conductor. He also, had he not been an artist, would have been a musician. There was a lot of musical ability in his family. He loved being around musicians. This is a fabulous, tall oil, again, with strong brushstrokes of a very famous African jazz player. He did a lot of drawings. You can see he does oil, he does pastels, he does acrylics, and he does just, pencil and charcoal. This is a wonderful drawing of a man he met, Rabbi Sonderling, who was a founder and a prominent educator, founder of a Fairfax Temple in LA and a very prominent educator. The rabbi was interested in the intersection of art and religion, art and spirit, so they spent a lot of time over coffee talking. Now, Kalman gave up any interest in God as a result of what he experienced in the Holocaust. He will not say God doesn't exist, he's just not interested in him. So Rabbi Sonderling wrote him a note and said, while you're not a religious man, you are a man of great spirit. Kalman was proud of that. A style that he developed that was entirely his own was named psychological realism. These are small and large studies of people, and if you notice, with very few lines and color, he creates these images of people. This is a small one of two men seated. It was in a show in Sweden, and the president of the University of Uppsala gave the style of painting the name psychological realism, and it stuck. Here's another small one, a woman in blue. And these are my favorites. He also does large oils in this style. This is the checker players. And you can see it's just usually a couple of large bodies of color and a few lines creating the image. This is the dreamer. One thing I learned, when Kalman paints, he goes to another place. It's a way he's maintained his sanity over a lifetime. It gave him a sanctuary inside himself. When he got to America, he made a decision not to discuss the past. He and Trudy made a conscious decision to make new American friends. He found that when he talked to other survivors, he just went down and became unable to function. But if you look at his art, I think he learned to do this in the camps. I think these are places that he took himself in order to survive. This is a large oil. And this one, Lady in Waiting, I love. The drawing on the left is a line drawing he did of one of his favorite models in the 1970s, and typical of Kalman, a decade later he'll go through his drawings, pull something out, and decide to do something with it. He pulled this out in the 1980s, and as you can see, he distilled and changed the mood of what he saw, and he again used three major fields of color And I'll use his own words to describe. He said, some years later, I decided to make a painting from the drawing. I tried to capture a mood. I changed a little bit of the face and the mouth to get the mood. And again, his eyes are exquisite and always expressive. He also became known immediately for his landscapes, and he paints landscapes wherever he is, whether he's in Europe or Canada or America. This is Laguna Beach. It happens to be the cove that my husband and I spent the first 2 nights of our honeymoon many years ago. This is a painting of the San Jacinto Mountains that are between Los Angeles and the Coachella Valley, where Palm Springs and Palm Desert is. In the 60s, a man commissioned him to go to Venice and just paint all over Venice. As always, he paints for himself as well. This is a painting of the ghetto in Venice. That's where the word ghetto originated. It was right here in this neighborhood. And this is a painting of the rooftops of Chinon in France. He and Trudy were married for 7 years. They divorced, and he met a woman named Suzanne in England, and they married and spent 10 months in Europe, and he will tell you it was the best time of his life. He loved painting the people, he loved painting the buildings, and he loved the light. Now, since Kalman wouldn't tell me his story, what I did is I asked myself, what were the first categories of paintings he did for himself, not on commission, but when he was at night, what did he paint for himself, just unconsciously do? And there were 3 categories: neighborhood children, landscapes, and then clear echoes of the Holocaust, things where he was working things out. So what I did is I looked at what he did in the 50s, and then I watched those categories change over time, because I believe his canvases are a mirror of what's going on inside. And if I were going to understand his own internal transformation, I had to see it in the paintings. This is a painting he did in the 50s, The Girl in Red. And as you can see, she's surrounded by darkness. There's no joy on the face of that young girl, but there's life in the garment. There's still life in the garment. In the 1950s, he went to visit his friend Saltsi Peretsman, with whom he survived, another Latvian. And he was in Brooklyn, and he just drew a regular drawing of 2 children. Didn't look like this at all. He came home and he painted this, and I call them the lost children. And if you look at them, they're in a fog. They look like European children that have survived the Holocaust or in the middle of it. And he said to my sister, I don't know why, but I gave the little girl the face of an old woman. Well, if you've experienced what children experienced during those times, you would be old before your time. And Kalman did all of this unconsciously. So then what I did is I took these 2 paintings that showed where he was inside in the 50s, and I looked at 2 other paintings that he did of children. Now, the Mexican boy he did in the 50s, but if you look at it, this little boy has a determined look. He's got vitality. He's going to face life and live it. And he's got a determination in his chin, which is just like Kalman. So I think he connected to those qualities in this little boy to recapture those qualities in himself. 20 years later, he painted the portrait on the far right. It's a portrait of my nephew, Eric. And you can see this boy is full of light and full of curiosity in his eyes. You cannot paint what you do not know and you do not see. So in looking at these paintings of children over time, I think by the time that he painted Eric, he's reclaimed some of that curiosity himself, inside himself, or he couldn't have painted that portrait. He married for a 3rd time. He met a woman named Tanis first in 1968. They had a wonderful honeymoon traveling and painting across America. He did a bunch of commissions in Texas, and then they went on up into Montreal. And they had a son. And I think, too, when you think about what he went through, it's got to be a conscious decision. Do I dare bring life into this world or not? And he did. And he did it with Tanis. And his son is an artist in New York who has had his own rough time because, as you know, children of Holocaust survivors carry that whole load if the parent hasn't resolved it. Now, the second category that I looked at were landscapes. He worked near Bunker Hill. Bunker Hill is where the Chandler Center and the Gary Music Center, Disney Center, sits in Los Angeles, overlooking the basin. In the late 1800s, some developer built these big Victorian homes, and they were very wealthy, and then the streetcars came, and the folks moved to Pasadena, and these became tenements. This is what he was drawn to draw in 1950 when he was working there. And if you look at this painting, there are no humans, there are no animals, there are no trees, and there is absolutely no color. And I think this reflected his interior landscape when he came to America. 30 years later, he painted the backyard of the mayor of Beverly Hills. He had done a commission, painted several portraits for this family, this mayor. And he asked, "May I paint your backyard?" And I always watched, what did he ask to do? He didn't have to stay there and do this. And if you look at this, it is full of light. The light is dappling through the trees, full of color. There's balance in it, there's harmony in it. So that, again, shows the progress that he made from 1950, where his interior world was totally gray, to a world where he's reclaimed color in his life, in his own life. And this last painting is one that he did in the 1980s. It's off his balcony. It's the night lights of downtown LA. And the reason that this is one my mom had, I love this painting because what it tells me intuitively, Kalman understands that there is no such thing as absolute darkness. There is always light and shadow within the darkness. The third category that he did were clearly where he was working out, and he did this late at night because he worked during the day, clearly where he was working out what he had witnessed in the Holocaust. This is an 8-foot by 3-foot painting of the mother and child, and I will use his own words. I came up with the idea of getting the two faces close together to show the bond of the mother and child and her anxiety, trying to run away from the ghetto or camp. Glued together, she will not let go no matter the punishment. And this is what he saw over and over and over again. So it's his portrayal of what happened, and it's a very unusual, this is now hanging in the Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust. The founder, Jonah Goldrich, wanted it there. The chairman said to me, "It's not a Holocaust painting." And I said, "That's because you don't see a lot of paintings of mothers and children because they were killed immediately." So the wise curator got Holocaust survivors around it and asked them, "Does this belong in this museum?" And of course they all said yes, and it hangs at the entrance. And if you look, there's always a reference to nature. He told me, "I put a moon in, I don't know why." But he always has some connection to nature. But this is sort of like a warped time, I mean, it's outside of our time and space. The second painting is one he did, it's a smaller oil of a mother and child. And to me, it's what happened to them in the Holocaust. And if you look at this mother and child, they're stripped naked. There's no light in their eyes, a tiny bit in one eye of the child. They are not bonded. They're not connected together, and they may not even be connected to themselves. So this is sort of an evolution of what happened to children and mothers as a result of what they experienced in the Holocaust. 30 years later, Kalman painted this portrait. This is in the style of psychological realism. Painted this painting of the mother nursing the child. And it amazes me that he could reconnect to the kind of tenderness and intimacy that's shown in this painting. His mother believed in a world of beauty and love. He said to me, of course she was wrong, but he's recaptured, I think, in this painting, he's recaptured the world his mother gave him as a child growing up. The next set that show his evolution are self-portraits. And this first one is a small, really small gouache that he did. And he's the skeleton figure. It's called Marching in the Camps. It's a symbolic one of his experience in the camps. It's quite powerful. He's in the center, and I noticed he's also here on the right. And then I realized, as I looked around at all these different faces, a sad man, a wise man, a terrorized man, that they were all aspects of what he experienced during the Holocaust. And I'm sure went through many, many different psychological phases. And what he ended up is in the front and center. And if you look at that, there's a steely strength. He's solitary among many. No light in his eyes. They're just dark black holes. There's a dark hole for the mouth for him to eat. It has in person, it feels like a medieval painting. He still has, if you look in the upper right corner, he still has some night sky there. There's your nature. There's your touch of nature. But there's no emotion permitted. He's become a skeleton of bones. For me, this is the image of what happens to a human being when we treat a human being the way he was treated. This is what we become. And I know from my healing practice, when we're traumatized, we have to give up our light in order to survive. Then the question is, can we regain it? This he did in the early 50s. And then next, oops, I'm going in the wrong direction. This is a self-portrait he did in 1934. He was 30 years old. And if you look at this, he's in two different worlds. His right side is in the shadow. His left side is in the light. And if you study his eyes, one is looking backwards, his right eye is looking backwards as though it's still trapped in the Holocaust. The other one is looking forward, but it's rather wary about the present. It's in the present. So what this tells me is that he's still straddling two parallel universes. He's in two different realities. He has not integrated what happened to him in the Holocaust with his new life in California. And he was 30 at this one. And now this one on the far right is a self-portrait he did when he was age 43. And you can see that color has returned. He's got the robust markings of a man who has lived. I used to think this was going to be the cover of the book, but I sat with it in Cape May. If you look at his eyes, there is so much sorrow in his eyes. You see that determined chin that he connected to with the Mexican boy's pastel? But there's a certain kind of wary watchfulness in his eyes. He is not comfortable yet in his own skin on this earth. So you can see that Kalman spent a lifetime painting to maintain his sanity. It's always been a place he can go and find peace. He metabolized, I think, the evil he experienced, literally working it out on canvas. And to a certain degree, we can see that he reclaimed his light. But he still kept his art under the radar. He has not given up the belief that if he's really seen, that he'll be safe. Everybody who was close to Kalman throughout his career has always said, get an agent, do the show in New York. He always had a reason not to do it. And he still, at this age, still did that. Now, in 2003, he made a huge decision to cognitively remember his story when he asked me to write it. I think that the pain of not remembering became greater than the pain of remembering. And it was a very courageous decision on his part. There were huge costs. The nightmares came back. He'd wake up with a racing heart. There were a lot of trips to the hospital. And I'll share one story. When he asked me to do it, I went out to spend 2 weeks interviewing him. I got a message at home, don't come. I'm in the hospital. I have pneumonia. I'm at Cedars-Sinai. Don't come. I was already out there because I was in Palm Springs seeing my mother. I sat down and did a meditation, and I asked for an image of what's really going on here. And I saw Kalman with this thick black vest of energy with spikes sticking out. And the energy of that vest in a very low voice said, we do not tell our story. Paint, keep your head down, and stay invisible. So I learned very quickly, and I shared this. He doesn't like my spiritual meditations. That's not where he goes. And I remember saying this to him, and he looked at me, and he was ready to dismiss it, and then he looked at me again, and he said, you're absolutely right, Susan. being invisible saved my life. So he has, throughout the 9 years, had a civil war going on inside him. There's this one voice of survival from the camp saying, you don't get seen out there. You don't write a book and have your life before the public. And then there was this other voice who said, I've just got to finally tell it. Now the benefits. The benefits are wonderful. I see 4. The first one is he is comfortable in his own skin. He has a new ease and peace within himself, and of course it always shows up on canvas. He's always painted men playing cards and chess and checkers in public parks in California, around Santa Monica and around his neighborhood. The one here on the left is the chess players done in the 1960s. The one down below on the right is our men playing cards in Roxbury Park in 2004 after he told me his story. And if you look at them, the old one has a brooding, heavy look, darker colors. There's one man in the center with his arm up here in angst, trying to figure out what to do. You look at the one he did in 2004. The colors are entirely different. They're lighter. You look at the men, they are not brooding. They're not penetrating the meaning of life. They are simply living it. And again, I think that shows one of the benefits of him becoming at ease in his own body, and it just always shows up on canvas. The second big decision he made after he told me his story, he'd been married 3 times and divorced. The last divorce was about 71. He met a woman in 2003, and they started dating, and they decided to get married. And he knew, he said, I hope we can bring each other happiness. He would have never opened his heart and married another woman, I don't think, if he had not told his story. So it was an opportunity to try and create an intimate relationship that brought happiness to him before he died. The third thing, and very powerfully, he had this painting of the mother and child in his studio for 60 years. He has a whole series of paintings he did around the Holocaust in the 50s. He had been asked to show these many, many times. The answer was always no. He wouldn't do it. In 2010, the new Tolerance Center in Rancho Mirage opened. He was asked if he'd show them, and he did. And that night, he ended up in the hospital. He was honored with a reception, and his paintings, his Holocaust paintings, and some of his normal ones. He ended up in the hospital. He almost died. That was in 2010. I arranged for him to have this painting hang in the new building in LA. The Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust is the oldest one in the country, and they created a new building on Pan Pacific Park. It was a dream of Jonah Goldrich. There was only one place this painting could hang, and it was in the front entrance, and it is there today. He held on to that for 60 years. He was not about to let it go until he had told his story and got comfortable enough. And what I learned is, as long as we don't heal whatever trauma we've experienced, we hold things tight. And once we've remembered and healed it, we can let go. And for him, that literally meant letting go of the painting. And this freedom to me is the big one, the freedom to be seen. When I grew up, and I've spent a lot of time with art, I would say to myself, why is he not more famous? He's always been successful. He's always paid his way. But why is this man not more successful? And it was this old belief about, if I'm seen, I'll be killed. He has given that up. We had, in last month in LA, in October, we had a book event presentation. There were 2 former governors of California, Rabbi Heyer, the dean and founder of the Simon Wiesenthal Center at the Museum of Tolerance, on stage honoring this man, introducing me to do this same presentation. Kalman stood and beamed for the first time, and that night, he did not end up in the hospital. So he has finally given up the belief that it is not safe to be seen. It is finally safe to be seen in this world for him. That is huge. So then I asked myself, what is his legacy? What is the legacy of a living master? for me, the first legacy is the power of his example, and it has played in my life. You know, every win we know is a mirror. I've learned so much from this journey with Kalman. But he not only survived, he pursued his passion, he's created art all of his life, and that is truly what he loves. He's done it and maintained his integrity. Everyone who knows Kalman will tell you, and including Trudy, what she really liked about him when she met him in Vienna. He was good looking and he was a wonderful mind, but he had integrity. He was not bartering like everybody else was, so he's always maintained his integrity. And you can see in his work that he's wrestled literally with the evil of what he witnessed and what he experienced. So in his body of art, there are no shortcuts here. He really worked this stuff out. Secondly, for me, I believe his body of art is a vessel of healing for other people. I believe that anyone who touches this book has the potential of having past trauma healed. His art carries literally the resonance of what he transmuted, what he transformed in himself, and that is a human condition. That is a universal reality. It doesn't matter who we are. What he went through is worse than anything I've gone through. But humans around the world suffer trauma and loss. And his being around his art somehow on an unconscious level helps people heal. Now, if they're consciously reading his story, that's even better. But I think it's a vessel of healing. I love the fact that that his journey's visual. I love being able to see him go from this world of gray to this world of color. And for me, that's personal alchemy that's available to all of us. We all do this in a lifetime. He just happened to do it on canvas from a place of darkness that few of us have ever known in this lifetime. The third legacy, I think, it certainly is for me, and hopefully for people around the world. I think his life is an invitation for all of us to go inside and deal with whatever hatred, anger, sorrow, or loss we have, so we don't project it on somebody else and go around and kill people, number one. And he's a very good example of what, if you have the courage to remember and go back to the trauma of the benefits that you get. So I hope it's an invitation for all of us to make different choices in resolving conflict so we don't resort to violence. The final thing that I think is so powerful about Kalman's life and speaks to me very deeply, I think his life is an invitation for us to remember we're all one, we're all connected, we're all human. And what we do to one person here, we do to ourselves here. I know that. I think when we all realize that, we're going to be able to literally live in peace among each other. And I'm hoping that this book will inspire people who have suffered brutality, witnessed genocide, been part of war, and it can also help people who have been brutalized in their own home or village. It doesn't have to be on a mass stage. Inspire them to take the same kind of journey that Kalman did to reclaim their own light. I believe we're walking sticks of light. And the more we go inside and know what's in every shadow and in the corners and see it, we have the ability then to bring light to all of it, and our own light is that much greater. If you saw his eyes today compared to the painting of him marching in the camps, you see the transformation of a human being. Thank you all very much.
If there are any questions?
You bet.
Okay.
I love questions. I'm a talker, you know. Any questions? Yes.
Since the book and your exploration of his art, have other paintings come forward of his that may have been sold to other people or given?
Yes.
Where? In Europe as well?
Not in Europe yet. I think that could happen in Europe. I've gotten a lot of emails of people showing me paintings that they or their parents had purchased. That's happened a lot. I've gotten emails from people who knew, for Saltsy's Parrotsman daughter found me because her father is gone now. So yes, things like that are happening. I also want to take an opportunity, I want to introduce two people that I see here today. The first is the brilliant publisher editor and owner of Posterity Press. I want you to stand, Philip. This book could never be what it was without you. And I honor you and I thank you. And I also want to ask Michael Carr to stand up. Michael has been a friend for years. She's a neighbor. She and her husband are creative filmmakers. They produce interactive museum exhibits. And when I started doing this, Al Hillman said, this is the camera you get. You go out there and you record these interviews with him on camera, not just orally. And they helped me in all kinds of ways, so thank you. All right, what other questions? Yes, Peggy.
So then you have all these oral histories. and
Yes.
interviews with them.
Yes, on film, thanks to Mickey and Al. I do. And I haven't had, I mean, I'd had them all transcribed, so I used them in creating the book. But one day there'll be something that can be done. I also have the Shoah transcript interview, which is on the book website now. If you go to kalmanaron.com, I have an internet person who knows how to do these things. And the full Shoah interview. And the most interesting part in the Shoah interview for me is, he was asked at the end by the interviewer, Dana Schwartz, is there anything you haven't told me that I've not raised a question? He said, well, there is one thing. I've never had a normal family life as my parents created for me. I've been an artist, and that's given me the freedom to do all of my art, but I regret that I don't have that. And she said, well, you're still young, you may remarry. And indeed, he did. Larry.
At what point in the process did you share your book or write it with him? What was his reaction?
That's a wonderful question. 2009, I will never forget it. I had the manuscript. I took it to him. I put it on the table in front of him, and he looked at me, and he looked away. He put his hand on it, and he looked away from it, and he said he was concerned that everything was accurate. That was the first thing. And then he said, leave it with me for a week. Let me read it. I mean, he was shaking. His body was shaking. He was very nervous. I'll call you when I've read it, and then you come back. I got a call, and I went over. I mean, the book could not have been published if it wasn't authentically his story. I mean, I went over, and he looked at me with those blue eyes. He said, Susan, I don't know how an American girl could possibly have understood what a European man went through. You've done it poetically. Keep doing what you're doing. And that was a huge relief, because everything would have stopped had that book not reflected who he was. And a lot of what I got in meditation. I sat in Buchenwald and said, Kalman, what do you want me to say about this camp? I put it in the book. I didn't say how I got it. I put it in the book in his voice. It was right. It was all right. And when Phil and I went out, an artist cares about the correct color reproduction of their paintings, period, end of story. It's very hard to get them correct. Phil and Robert and I went out to do the color correction. When I sent him the printed book, he was thrilled. He said the paintings are all the right color. One actually is a little off, because I happen to know that. He is absolutely thrilled with this book and this story. Lynn.
Susan, this was a 9-year, 9.5-year journey for you. You traveled a lot, had lots of research. What was the highlight and the lowest for you?
Okay, I'll repeat that since during the webcast. Lynn's asking, in all of the research and the experience, what was the highlight and the low light? I think the low light was sitting at Studehof in front of a gas oven, and I don't remember whether it was a crematorium or a gas. It could have been a crematorium. And as I sat there, it's very interesting. Buchenwald, the Germans have done more soul searching than the other countries that I visited, for sure. And Buchenwald has had a cleansing process. The Dalai Lama's been there, Buddhist monks have been there, toning and chanting. Studehof, Poland doesn't have money. It felt like the way it felt when he was there. I mean, the imprint was so powerful. And I sat there to try and get a feel of what it was like for Kalman and his brother, and my back went out. It just flat out went out. So I think that may have been the time that I was in the energy of his experience, perhaps the most. There were other very moving times, but that was really, really heavy. More so than Buchenwald, which is surprising, because Buchenwald was awful, but not as awful as Stutthof. The highlight, I learned that even though I did not, Kalman was a mirror to me. I always said, there's no way I can understand what you went through, but I must, as my husband said, you must go to those sites. You cannot write this book if you're not where he lived and where, and serendipitously I found these camps in Latvia. It was just, it was fabulous. I did a meditation in Rumbala with his spirit, his mother's, his father's, and his brother's. It was profound. It was on the ground where she was killed with 25,000 other people. And what I realized, the terror that he experienced, I know that terror. I don't know why I know it. I don't know whether it's in our DNA, in our humanity. I know the terror. His heart was like a shriveled prune, and his mother wanted to give him a new heart. His father said, don't blame God, blame people. People did this. And his brother said, forgive me for not protecting you. I actually typed this up and gave it to him, and his body shook. I said, you want me to take it with me or leave it? He said, leave it. But then about 2 weeks later, his son called. Don't do any of that spirit stuff with him. It upsets him too much. I've learned in my healing practice that I'm capable of doing everything that any human's ever done. And I'm responsible for cleaning myself up inside, wherever the anger, the sorrow, the rage, the hatred, whatever it is. And I believe there'll be no peace in my world or the world until we individually do this. But I knew what Kalman had, I knew that terror, that stunned me. I also sat one time and realized he literally sent his light out in order to survive. He couldn't have survived if he had kept his full light in. I had done that in my history as well. And I remember the day that I went, aha. I knew that mine wasn't in this solar system. It was a long ways away. So I think the commonality of what we share, which gets us back to the reality that we are all one, and what happens to him happens to me. What I do to this person, I'm doing to myself. I think maybe that realization. Thanks, Lynn. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Susan. Thank you. I just want to tell people that there are books for sale in the back, and Susan will be happy to sign them if anybody wants. And thank you all for coming.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.